Well, thank you for showing up, and that's what my talk's going to be about, is the future of HCI. And a lot of it's going to be technologies that are just up and coming. Some of them you probably have seen and used yourself, but to give you an idea of where we're headed in the next few years. So what HCI really is, it's just how do we get data out of the computers. So we have all these computers that have a lot of different data, and it's just how are we going to interact with it. And HCI covers a lot of different aspects. It goes under a couple of different names. One is the human-computer interface, is how we deal with our desktops, our smartphones. It's an actual computer that we're dealing with. Another name that's in the same area is human-machine interface. And that is more if you don't see the computer that you're dealing with. But a good example of that is when you're in your car, you're dealing with the stereo, you're seeing how fast your speed is going, the GPS, all of those on how you deal with them with your hands while you're driving, those are all the machine interface. Well, they're all just one large field. And that field is just how do we get data from a computer and how do we use it. Now, the total idea of what the HCI is, it deals with a lot of different aspects. What it truly is, it's the complete user experience when you're dealing with the device. So here I have the example of the latest iPhone. And when this came out, there was a whole lot of talk about the new changes in the HCI. We heard about all the flatness in the icons. So HCI, it deals with everything. It's the icons, the font, the colors that they use, the different effects, how you have input and output devices, and there's a lot of different aspects. So, with this iPhone, that was the latest thing that they came up with, that they were changing the design to make everything look a lot easier for people to use. They're making everything to start to look flat. That no longer did all the icons have like a 3D shadowing effect on it. No, they just made it that it was just a 2D dimension. But in order for it not to look too flat, they started changing that as you tilt it, your background had a 3D effect to it. So you can see here, as the phone is moving, you can see that the little girl at the end, she comes in and out of the focus a little bit because they started adding in these little effects to it. That all of this should overall allow you to have a better experience. Now, the part that I'm real interested in is the input and output. And on here, these are the input and outputs that we probably use more often. We have the keyboard and the mouse. Those are the ones that are practical that every desktop has. And then outside of that, all our phones are now getting into the touchscreen interfaces. We start to view that as a traditional type of input for us. But now we're used to that. For you that play video games, those controllers are your input and output device as well. And we've seen that those have changed over the last few years. And then the tablets with the pins, we deal with that. If you're in graphic design, you might draw on it. Or when we check out from paying with a credit card, we use that type of device. Well, all of these are different ways that we can interact with a computer. And my whole interest is to try to figure out different ways that we can use these devices. Now, what I like to look at is the more non-traditional interfaces. So, here we had, it was a keyboard, but it was done through lasers. And then that way you could just have the keyboard on your smartphone, and you could just, leave it out there. The other item was, starting to use speech in order to have your input come out. And this one has started to pick up a little bit more. I mean, probably all of us use this in the car when we're using our phones. We tell it to dial somebody. Well, all the speech is starting to now start picking up. And then the last part is all the gestures that we use on our tablets. It's not just a point and click anymore. We have that we can zoom in, we can zoom out, go back and forth. We started to add all these gestures to it. And looking at these non-traditional interfaces is really where I'm trying to look at, is to see how we can use computers in a little bit different of a way. So what I imagine is that we have a unique, fully interactive interface, one where you don't have to be with a keyboard and mouse. So we can try to kind of change it. So here in this picture I have here, you can see that there's multiple displays, and the person is using their hands to kind of control it. So, if you've ever seen the movie Minority Report, You could, Tom Cruise is having that fancy computer display. It's just using his hands. Well, we're pretty close to already having all that technology available. All the stuff we see in the movies, are pretty much coming out now. So what I'm going to go through is a couple of the items that I've been doing with my students. And here I have a list of the different interfaces that are a little bit different and how we can kind of use them to do different aspects. So the brain interface is one I'm going to talk about first, and that is that you can start using your mind to start controlling your computers. And that one that was a project done a couple of years ago, so I have a video of the students working with it. The natural user interface, that's more of the hand gestures. And I have some videos of the technology, and that's something that students are currently still working on. Then I have the third topic is haptics. That was a topic that was done last summer during the SURF program. So I have students who are looking at how you get feedback to a person. The tangible interface is how we can start having different objects in our everyday lives being able to control something. So getting a little bit away from, number 2, or using your hands. Here you're going to physically grab something. And then the last one is an area that I do have new interest in, is the virtual reality. And that can use a lot of the different techniques that I'm going to describe. Okay, so the first one is trying to use your brain to control the computer. So I'll show you the video that the students made. Let's see if you can hear the sound.
My partner Jody is going to do a demo on the human-computer interface. He's going to be wearing the headset and thinking, sending thoughts to the computer. And the computer's going to send thoughts through the interface to the robot. So right now, Jody is going to move forward with the robot.
So on this one, there's no joystick controlling it. It's all through the thoughts of the student who was sitting down. So what he's trying to do is he's telling through his thoughts that he wants the robot to move forward. He wanted it to rotate left and right directions. So some of it is it's not perfect, and there's a lot of stuff that is a little shaky in the way it's being controlled. So how it actually works is you can see him wearing this helmet. And what the helmet is, it's a lot of electrodes that attach to your scalp. And on this one, it's able to pinpoint 14 different locations that the electrodes attach to. And they're the common locations where the social sciences have been looking at already in the past. And they can see that you have an intake in activity that's occurring in that one area of your brain. So what happens is this little headset, it produces a EEG on all 14 points. And what it's doing is it's sending that all wirelessly to the computer. And the computer is trying to make sense out of all the data that's coming into it. So we have these 14 spots on it. And what we're trying to do is understand the signals that are coming in from the locations on the brain. Now, we're not going to be able to, at the point right now of understand, what I'm saying, make sense of speech. We're not there yet. But what we're able to do is see which parts of the brain light up. And by looking at that, what we're going to try to do is form patterns. And we're going to look at, if I think a certain thought, I'm going to take a snapshot of that. And then later I'm going to see, can I find that snapshot again as we keep repeating. So, this is the little graph, and this shows all the 14 items. And the values you're going to get are going to be fairly small because what's coming out of your brain is not that large to begin with. Now, this takes a lot of practice in order to get to work. It's not something that's widely, I say we're at the point where everybody can use one of these yet. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Some of the real problems with this is every person is going to produce a different signal. And even if you train it off of one person, the little patterns you're going to see is going to change from minute to minute almost. Now, what this does have a problem with is there is a long learning time in order to get this to actually work. So what these students did, what I'm going to talk a little bit here, is getting it to move was, the way we did it was we were visualizing certain actions. And what we were visualizing was to move forward, the student would just focus and start thinking about trying to move that robot, actually push it. So it wasn't that it was thinking forward and we were trying to understand that it was going to be a forward. What we were doing was he was sitting there and thinking about physically pushing it. And by physically pushing it, we were able to see different spots in the brain, a little bit light up. Some of it have to do with, the actual motor control they were going to do. To move backwards, he was thinking about actually pulling it towards him. To turn right and turn left, he was thinking about trying to pick something up and then letting it go. So it wasn't, forward, back, left, right. It was, I'm going to push, pull, lift, or I'm going to drop. But those kind of actions we can visualize, and that's where we're going to try to form our patterns off of. So, that took a long time to, do this training because the student had to physically sit there and think about pushing something over and over again so we can get a predictable pattern on all these 14 signals that were coming through. Now, this did take, a lot of time for him to actually focus. It wasn't that he could just do it by just thinking push. No, he actually, was straining real hard to actually get something to move. So it's kind of like, like the Star Wars with the Force. He was actually, really working to try to get it to work. Well, this did cause a little bit of problems. We took this to a senior design competition. There was, the different presentations, and then we have demos. And, he was getting this to work for a couple hours with people coming. And by the end, he just had the largest headache. He says, I just couldn't, concentrate. So this does have a little bit of downsides, and that is, how much focus it takes. The other thing that we discovered was, when he initially trained it, he was in a quiet room. But then once students started coming in, from classes, there's a lot of talking going on, it was a little bit harder to, get the same item to come up. So, we could always add more functions into here. So here I just have 4 basic ones that we looked at. Now we can always add a 5th and a 6th. But the more that we add, the longer it's going to take to train. So when we started with just pushing, that's all we focus on. We push, and then we just understood all the signals that were occurring. Then when we added pulling, we had to do both of those actions over again and try to see where the difference was going to come up. So, here, if we had push, pull, and lift, where I would have my incoming signal, and I would try to see how closely they match all 3 actions. So here, if I said push matched 60% of it, pull was 30%, and lift was 65%, this wouldn't have been enough for me to be able to make a distinction between the push and the lift. So I have to go back and train it until I could get those percentages a little bit higher up there. Until you could get at least 15 or 20, then you can say, okay, let's move on to the next item. Now, this does seem like it could have a lot of benefits in the future. It's just, a little bit more work needs to be going in. So the next area is this idea of the natural user interface. And this is, a little bit about how we can use our body movements to actually control the computers. Now, a lot of the stuff that you see in this area is very similar to like a touch screen. But the difference is going to be that the cost starts coming down. So, if I was going to do this with, giving a presentation, just like when we have for a browser, web browser, I can swipe it forward, swipe it back. I would kind of do the same actions. in order to get the slides to change. So that's going to have us that it's going to cost a little bit less, and the size of the screens we use, we're not going to be limited by the technology, because all it's going to be is going to be a camera. All of this is going to be based off of image processing. While the EEG, we're looking at trying to make patterns out of it. Here we're going to look at images, try to find center points, and try to figure out how close items are. Now this has a large advantage over the brain interface in that all the movements are going to be the same. We won't have to train it for different people. Okay, so we have two different technologies that the students are working at. So this one, there's no sound to these videos, but I'll explain what's occurring. So this first one is a device called a Leap Motion. And a Leap Motion, it's a small little device, probably around that thick, maybe that wide, probably the size of a business card in length. And what it does is it's trying to be a very precise device to measure your hands. So in this demo, we have a student who is showing how it works with their hands. So the device, you can see it's on the table a little bit below here. So the student will put out his hand, and once he gets the hand in front of it, the device is able to read all the fingers on his hands. So he'll move it through, as he wiggles his fingers, we can see that it's able to detect all the little movements that are occurring. Now there are some items where right there he closed his hand, but it was still able to detect something being there. So it still has its little bit of hiccups in it. And it could do up to the full hands together. And occasionally when the thumbs get too close, lose track of the two individual thumbs. Now with this, in the future, we'll be able to take this technology and you could just view like if there was like a knob you wanted to control, you could do that motion with it. The other two videos are using a Microsoft Kinect. So if you play, Xbox 360 or Xbox One, you probably have used this technology in the games. So when we're looking at how we can use this to do an actual application, this are already items that we're looking at using. So on this first one, we're just trying to get an actual skeleton of the user. And then what we're going to do is try to figure out where the user is moving. So, it's going to be a mirror image because that's the way the device is made to be looking at you. So you see it flipped a little bit. And you can see that it can move the hands and the legs. The only downside is proportions are wrong. The legs, the arms look so, almost going past the knees here. And you can get that, you can move up and down. And then we're going to get a second person to come in so you can see that it can detect two different people and have two different skeletons. And we're at least able to get that you can have the height difference between the two people. So I had them dance and act like a little silly. So, this is, we're using the cameras and we're trying to use the image processing to build this skeleton. Now, what's occurring in the actual image is it's trying to create what's called a depth image. And the colors are kind of showing how close and how far an item is away from it. So right here, we can see that, as he moves his hands forward, the one that comes closer becomes the brighter object. So it's showing that the color is kind of distinguishing, what's close and what's far away. And, this we'll be able to use, like I said, if we were controlling the PowerPoint, with just our actions, we'll be able to see that the hand moved forward in the way it's swiped. So everything's going to be based off of having these items of being, we're going to kind of detect how close and how far objects are. So the way these work is I'm looking at the Microsoft Kinect, and there's two versions. There's the first version that came out with the Xbox 360, and then the second version came out with the Xbox One. They both try to do the same items of distinguishing how close and how far objects are away. To get that you can move your hands around and build a skeleton. But the way they decide to go about doing it are using two different approaches. So what the first version did was, well, both of them are based off of using an infrared light that shines out, and we're going to look at stuff off of the reflection of the light. So we use IR just so our eyes won't be able to see it. So the way the first Kinect worked is it tried to make a stereo image. So stereo image is just like how we see depth. We have two eyes, and the distance between the eyes we know is fixed, and we can try to figure out exactly, how different the left eye is from the right eye. We can get an idea of the depth. So this is the way the Kinect works. Now they did a little bit different in that they did not use two cameras. What they did was they have one camera for the IR, and what would have been the second eye they use as a light source. And the light source is going to have depth information that it's going to project, that it will be able to see exactly how close and how far away it is. So there really is still a stereo image. It's just one is light and one is a receiver. So in this video, what we have is all your cameras have an IR filter on top of it. And if you remove the IR filter, your cameras are able to see the lights. So here the IR filter has been removed. And all the stuff you see in the bluish color is the light that's being projected. Now in here we see it's not a clear wash to the light. It's almost like a noise type of pattern where everything is splattered. So this is where that stereo image comes into play. In that since it's not a complete, on like a flashlight where it's completely shining, since there is some texture to this, what we are doing is that one eye is projecting this light, and we know exactly the pattern it's going to project. And then when the receiver sees it, the distortions in that pattern is going to tell us, what it hit and how the light reflected back. The other item that it adds is the light source it projects. As we'll run the video, you'll see it creates a checkerboard pattern. And with that checkerboard pattern, when we see it, let's say we have a dark side and a light side. If it hits my face, I'll be able to see how it warps around my face. And that'll be able to give me some idea of the depth in the image. So this is just the light that's being shined. And you can see that it's that speckle pattern. Now you're not able to see the checkerboard until a clear image comes out. So this is just a white piece of paper. And you might be able to see that there's a little bit difference between a light and a dark. I don't know how far away you're sitting is going to be able to see it. But it's going to use those two items to try to get an item of depth. So we have this checkerboard that we know how large each of those squares are. So depending on how I see it on an image, I know how close and how far I'm away. And if it warps around the side, I can tell how it changed. The pattern that's also being shown, again, like I said, is if we see that that pattern has shifted in any way, I know exactly how far away the person has been. So this technology, it's a very simple, the cost is not too high. All it requires is just one camera and then one little light source. Now, the company that made this for Microsoft last year was bought out by Apple. So we might be seeing that, all the new iPads, the iMacs will have this built into it. Because they already have all the technology, they licensed it from them. So we might see that this starts being used a little bit more common. What the second version of the Kinect use is a little bit different type of camera system. It still uses IR light, but this is going to be a more precise way to understand the actual depth. What it's called is, the camera is called a time of flight camera. And what it's going to do is, for a short burst, it's going to light up the IR light, and then it's going to see how long it takes for a reflection to come back. And by knowing that we send out this light, and we're able to capture exact times that when it comes back, we're able to get the distance. Now, Microsoft, on their tech specs, they claim that it does over 1 million of these light patterns every second. So it's going to get a real precise calculation. Now, what this is going to allow us to do is going to have a higher level of precision, because now we don't have to do a lot of image processing to find out the actual depth. The raw data values we're getting is going to tell us the actual distance away for every pixel. So I have no video for this, but there's a number of images. Let's see if I can make it bigger. A little bit bigger. So the way this works is, here's our scene. So it's a vase, a Luigi figure, and a lion in the back. And at 0 nanoseconds, we're just starting off the light. Then 1 nanosecond later, we take that image and we capture it, and we see what is starting to show up in the picture. So here we can barely start making out some outline, so we know those are the closest items. So if we send out that light, we know the speed of the light, we know the time, we really know that at these points here, that's how far away they are. Then at 2 nanoseconds, we can start making out a little bit of the face of the doll. We go down to, again, still 2 nanoseconds, started coming a little bit more brighter. And then it starts to wash out the face. As we get to 8, the background's starting to come in. When we get to 10, the light has already passed by the doll. And now we're seeing mostly of it in the background. And then once we get to 11, we can see that it's all silhouette in the foreground. The background has a little bit of the light left. So this is how we're going to get a lot more precise measurements on the depth. Because we built that sensor to be so sensitive to the light and at such a fast speed that now we're going to be able to track all these items. Now, what we're going to do with this image is just like I showed you the Kinect, how they're going to make a black and white image. We're still going to have a black and white image, but the different shades of the color are going to have a distance to it. Now, with all of these technologies, they still have the problem that we have to be a set minimum distance away from the camera. Because if we're too close, we're not going to be able to read, the light has returned back to us. So both of these, they're, are very interesting technologies because these are quickly, we're seeing these occur in real life. The games have used them, but it's not just the games are going to be the items that use it. Eventually we're going to get that when you go to a store, the billboard, billboards are going to have it. You can use this for a lot of items. So hopefully, I currently have a few students who are working in this field. I have Cameron, who's here in the audience. He's working on it to try to use your hand to control a robot. So what we have is we have a robotic arm, and we're using a combination of Kinect and that leap motion to kind of control how the robotic arm is. So you'll put your arm in it, and as you move your arm, the robot will move to follow you. Now, we're using 2 technologies so we can get 2 levels of precision. So we can have the Kinect doesn't have the best precision. We could just move across, have an understanding of where the arm needs to move. And then for the arm that we have can actually pick up items. So for that, we're going to use the leap sensor in front so we can see exactly how the pressing to pick up. And then I have other students who are looking to build like a big, large touch interface computer system. So to give you an idea of how these technologies can be used, this one video is for a medical company that is trying to use this interface in hospitals. So that way the doctors, as they're doing surgery, can access the computer, but they don't have to take off their gloves, go through the whole process of sterilizing themselves again. So on this one, it's to see X-ray images. So you can see that the surgeon is just using his hand to get through all the images that are showing up. Now, this is probably the way that we're going to start seeing this interface being used, not just in this environment, but if you have it in your own home. So there's some TVs that you can change the channel with, moving your hand around. This is probably the way we're going to see a lot of emerging use of this technology. Now, this second video is from another university, and it's that their students developed a real large touchscreen interface. So the one that they created, I think it could fit around 14 people, and it could track all 14 users. So you can see that all the different people sitting around the table, all of them are moving and manipulating the image at the same time. Now, what they're using is, it's like the Kinect technology. So it's not a touchscreen, it's just a piece of glass that has cameras projecting from below it. And you can see that as they're moving, we can get the precision enough that we can track 14 different people. So hopefully during the summer, I'm going to have students who are going to be trying to emulate this type of research, with me during the summer. Because a lot of that is, we can still have that touch interface, but now we're not confined to small sizes. Right, so the next one is haptics. And what haptics is, it's giving feedback to the user. So it could be something that's an audible sound. So like when we're putting in a phone number to a smartphone, we're not able to actually feel that we pressed the 1 or the 2, whatever number we're pressing. So we have some click or some sound that tells us, oh, you pressed something on the phone. It could go even back that if you're playing video games, you feel the vibrations on the controller. Those are the haptic feedback that we have. So these are becoming very important once the user is removed from the physical device. So when we're typing, we know exactly that we press the keys because we feel it. But if we move to typing on a complete touch screen, we need to know that we actually pressed it. So on this one, last summer, as part of the SURF project, I had a group of students that looked at what they called their project the feeling of sound. And what they wanted to do was to see how they could use haptics so that instead of just hearing the song that's being played, you can actually feel something coming back to you. So what they did was, their whole research project was how to create these haptic motors. So they kind of really looked at, what motors were best and, where we could place them on the body so that you could have the most feedback from it. So what they did was they decided to create like a wristband that would go around your hand, and that's how you're going to feel the feedback. So the initial idea was we were going to have 4 motors, 2 on the side ends on the top part of your hand, and 2 for the bottom side of your hand. Now, we had to change this a little along the way just because of the size of the motors. The larger you get them, the farther away they have to be before you can feel they've become different. But this was our initial idea on how we're going to be able to control and have this feedback mechanism occur. So the idea would be that we will play the song, and then through these motors, we'll be able to feel items that were occurring in the song. So the idea was we can have these motors work in a number of different ways. So we could do it that each motor, we could do like a pulse effect. This pulse effect would turn on the motor, turn it off, turn it on, turn it off, so you could just feel it pulsing. We could have it that it could be like a ramp effect, so it could go slow and come up, or we could just have it that it would be constantly on. Now, since we had 4 motors at 4 different positions on the wrist, we could have it have some type of effects to it. So if we wanted to feel that it was like a rotating effect going across your entire hand, we would turn on different motors at different times so that the first motor, you would feel it, then you'll feel it move to the next one and go all the way around your hand. So we wanted to get that we can have some effect besides just having the motor pulse on and off. That way you can have, as the song played, something would occur. Oops. So this is what we ended up coming out with. So it was just a wristband that had different motors on it. It's pretty large because of the computer chips we were using. If we really wanted to create this, we have to make everything a little bit smaller. And in this was the program that they created. So you would just open up a song, and what would happen is this image here, we were looking at all the frequencies in that song. So this one we worked off of the bass frequencies, and on the bass we would kind of read the bass, and it would just control the motors on how they were spinning in your hand. This one I don't have a video because it's kind of hard, because all you're going to do is feel it. But this is going to become more important as we move away from having a complete touch interface. So this is the next topic, which is having tangible interfaces. So instead of just using our hands or using like a keyboard to type in, we can have everyday objects become our interface. So we have a lot of new sensors that are coming on that can look at how you rotate, tilt different objects, how hard you're pressing on the objects. So with all these new sensors, we should be able to use them in interesting ways. So this was the first real successful tangible interface device. So this was, I can't remember, it was a university in Europe that did this one. And they did it for like kind of like a DJ type of sound effects. So it's a table, and on these tables they have different blocks, they have different shapes. Each shape is giving it a different symbol to it. So one of it is, it's still a touch interface where he's controlling how loud each item is. But also these devices, it's able to know exactly which block you place onto the screen. So on there, now it's a square wave. He's hearing the square wave. And it's going to be able to tell that he's actually turning it to change the effect that's occurring. And what these blocks are is, you can't really see them in the video, but they're three-dimensional blocks, so each side has a different effect on it. And then later he'll grab another block to make the other two actually make sound. So you can get an idea of how we can have objects that we control actually do something. So using this idea, I came up with, this was another research project that was done over the summer. And it was to see how can we do this tangible interface. Now the one we came up with is not going to look as nice as the one I showed you, but you get the idea of what we're trying to do. So on this one, the project was aimed at young children. To see, could we teach children how they can have like a cause and effect relationship. And they'll use actual puzzle pieces to build something. So in here, what we're doing is each piece of a puzzle is a computer piece. And they're going to have to combine the pieces together to create something. And what they're going to create is an MP3 player. So the way this works is each puzzle piece has its own component to it. So here in this red, we have a battery. The blue would be our processor, which would be playing the MP3s. The yellow would be a speaker, so they can hear it. And then the green would be some type of input device. So the idea will be that the kid will have to start off with knowing that they need a battery. And they connect the MP3 with the battery, the MP3 would start playing. Now, they wouldn't hear anything until they connected the speaker to it. So once the speaker turns on, now they can be able to hear it. And it wouldn't matter where they connected any device to, because all the connections go through. They connected to battery, connected to MP3 player, it wouldn't matter. You would still hear sound. Then the input, this green item would come in. If they put the input next to the speaker, they can control how loud the sound is coming out. If they put it next to the MP3 player, they can change what track is playing. So you can have a lot of different pieces, and as you combine them, the kid will see how everything is interacting. So the way we created it is each piece had a computer chip with it, and then the connections that connected two pieces together had the power and the communication bus in order to get all the pieces to talk to each other. So this was the one that we came up with. That's what I said. It's not as nice as the other one. But you can see we have our little puzzle pieces. And each piece has its own computer with it. So here, this computer here is our MP3 player. Over here on this breadboard, it displays, what song is playing. So it has its own computer. And on this one, it has the keypads. You can change the song and control how loud it is. And it's kind of hard to see, but here we have little metal pads that actually touch so that we knew which pieces were talking with each other. So this gives us the idea where we can have some type of tangible interface occur. Then the last one, which I haven't really worked on yet but have interest in, is this whole virtual reality aspect to it. Virtual reality is probably, it's been along for a while already, but it hasn't hit, consumer market ever. And a lot of it now is we have the technology that we can do it. The screen resolutions we have, our phones can do, HD video. Well, those are perfect for the size that would cover our eyes. We can have a complete realistic experience. Now, there's two major companies that recently you probably would have heard about in the news. One is Oculus Rift, which Facebook bought for $2 billion like 2 weeks ago. So, they made it to be on video games, but Facebook bought it because they saw that there's potential that it could be a community type of experience. So it's like ideally, I think you're going to see that Facebook makes like a second life that's actual, virtual reality. And then Sony, a couple of weeks ago, announced that for their new PlayStation, they're coming out with their own virtual reality helmet as well. Now, all of these, should have some new aspect of HCI that can easily be incorporated into it. So, this brain interface device is easily seen that it can be part of this virtual reality. If you're really going to put on a helmet to see the VR, you might as well have it read, what your brain is thinking. These natural gestures, those are going to be important. And then there's still going to be something, maybe it's not tangible, but some other device that makes it an immersive experience. Okay, so there I have this shoe. And the shoe is for this device that somebody made for the Oculus Rift. And what it allows them to do is walk around so they can experience, moving in a three-dimensional world. So there's some sensors in the shoe so they can tell, how they're moving. The other items is, I'll show you the video on how it works, that you don't see is there's a number of those Microsoft Kinects that look at the body to see how they're moving. So the way this works is they created a platform that you will stand in. And there's braces that hold you up because the surface you stand on is very slick. That way, as you slip, you automatically slide back into place. So you can see that as he walks, he's moving around in the video game. So it's a very slick surface. There's ridges in it so that you can actually have some traction, and that way the sensors in the shoe will actually fit into the grooves that are being placed. So, with all of this stuff that's coming out, it's going to be, in the next few years, you can have this in your home. And you'll be able to, have different experience. There's different ones for the Oculus Rift where, you could go through, different cities, and you can walk around the complete city and see all the different stuff that's occurring. So I have a number of students that have worked with me over the past few years on these projects. And this is, a list of all of them. The majority have all been undergrads. I have only one master's student who's working with me. And two of them are here. So Cameron's doing the interface one, and Viet, he's doing the tangible one. But it's a lot of fun work for these students to actually see. It's a little bit interesting to explain your research as something that's a little bit more fun when it comes to like computer stuff. So that's everything I have for my talk. If you guys have any questions. Nope. Yes?
I'm just curious about the one that you showed in the beginning that hooks up to the brain waves. Does anyone working on that, would they have to have knowledge of, like, what's the science that has to do, like a neurologist, like neurology or the physiology of the brain?
It probably will help. Like me and the students who work on it, we had no idea on it. We were just looking at how the signals were being displayed.
Displayed on like,
so we had all the electrodes coming in, and then we would see how they were working together. Yeah. A lot of them is if you know what area of the brain it is that you're looking at. You could only if you wanted to do something with if they were closing or opening their eyes, then having that background would tell you exactly which one of those sensors to actually look at. Yeah.
Were those all commercially available devices, or did you build any of those, or was that little?
That EEG, yeah, that we bought because we weren't going to be able to build it. Yeah.
That said, they're cheaply commercially available in a lot of cases. The Leap Motion was $70.
Like everything I have bought has probably been under $300.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
EEGs traditionally are not available for under, tens
right.
of thousands of dollars, and this is, it's consumer grade,
Yeah.
but a consumer grade EEG is better than, no EEG.
Oh, sure, I'll do that.
And even at Oculus Rift, that's I think $250. So it's not that expensive either. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you.